Let me be clear. The wrong way of drawing is drawing in a way that doesn't deliver for us the sorts of drawings that we want. Particularly if we take into account the amount of practice, experience, the number of drawings that we've done. Why is it that it's so easy to fall into the place where we have drawing after drawing that we're unhappy with? I think it's because we're not drawing in the way we need to draw to get those results. And this often comes from a misconception as to the way we should think about and start and progress a drawing. So let me share what I believe is at least a right way to draw, because this is my way of drawing, my way of thinking and starting and progressing. And I find it consistently now delivers the sorts of results I'm after when I'm drawing freehand in ink. And it doesn't matter whether I'm drawing an architectural scene, such as here, or something more natural, more trees and plants and so forth. So the right way for me, certainly, is that before I start, I have to plan what I'm doing. Now, that starts with choosing a reference. But I think what often happens is that with less experience in drawing, choosing the reference is about the only planning that happens, finding a photo to draw. And we grab the photo and then we start to draw, because our thinking is that we're copying the photo. And so we start copying whatever part we think possibly looks easiest, and then we just draw around the reference and around our paper in the same order as we work out how we're going to go. And then we're not happy with the result for different reasons. So what's a better way of thinking that I just need to draw and start drawing? Firstly, I find the reference, but I don't go anywhere near my ink, because instead I need to think, now, why am I drawing this? Why does this subject interest me? Because my answer to that will give me things to focus on when I start to plan how exactly I am going to put the ink on the paper. For what purpose? What do I want to be the star of the drawing? Is there something that's particularly interesting for me in this reference? So in this I think it's a gatehouse from a very old park in Sydney, to the west of Sydney. This gatehouse, what do I really like about it? Well, I like that sort of the design of the corners and the contrast between the lightly painted mock stone corners and the brickwork. I really liked that. So I want to capture that in my finished drawing. So I know before I start, this will be a fairly inky drawing. So what is it that I like, and what effects am I going to be wanting to capture? So I'm going to also want to have that foliage behind, because that's a wonderful contrast. But I don't have colour to distinguish what's what, so I need to keep it a fairly light effect so that it doesn't get tangled up with the ink of the gatehouse. So this is what I'm thinking before I even start. And now I have to just really observe the reference carefully. I have to find all the things that are likely to be tricky, again, before I'm putting ink on the paper. Are there any complicated parts of this? And are there parts where I may want to change things, to simplify things slightly, to give myself a better chance of a drawing that I'm happy with at the end? Or do I want to move anything around? Particularly when there are people, figures in the scene, I often shift them slightly so that they work in better with what's behind them, what's around them, that they're not obscuring perhaps a really interesting part of the architecture, or they're going to just blend in with the background. I move them to where there's going to be a bit more contrast behind them, and therefore they'll stand out more. So all of these things, am I happy with the composition? Am I happy with what's there? Do I need to crop one of the sides or the top or bottom slightly to shift the center of gravity of the main subject, if there is a main subject, rather than an overall scene? So once I've got the composition worked out, once I've looked really carefully at the reference, once I've made adjustments, once I've got a sense of what excites me about this to look at, that I want to try and emphasize in my drawing, at that point now, I'm now starting to think of the ink marks. What marks will get the effect that I want? And if you're looking at this demo as well as listening, and I hope that you are, I've already done something which I wouldn't do if I were doing this again, and that's the lines for the brickwork. Now, these lines are to represent the color, the dark value, the bricks that are in the shade. And I've used horizontal lines, and I did have a reason for doing that, but I don't think it worked as well as if I'd done horizontal lines. Well, by horizontal lines, I mean lines that follow the perspective angles of the courses of brick. I think that would have worked better. However, that's something I've learned for next time. And the next thing I need to do is I figure out the depths of plane. Now, in this scene, it's fairly straightforward for my thinking. There's really only two depths of plane. There's the gatehouse and there are the trees behind. The figure I'm including in the same depth of plane as the gatehouse. So, but this is important because with different depths of plane, I'm likely to be thinking of different techniques for drawing the same thing. If there's a tree closer, I'm going to use different line work, different marks to draw that, and different values, darker values, than I am to draw the trees that are in a further back depth of plane. And I'll quite possibly use a different pen, or I'll use the same pen, but I'll deliberately use it as perhaps lightly as I can to create a different effect, a different feel that will help give the sense of further away. And if you haven't seen me do that before, then watch when I draw the trees at the end as an indication, as an example of how I draw these trees when they're very much the background and they're further away. So for now though, I'm doing this lace work, this wrought iron, and this is a good example of drawing the effect of the detail, not the actual detail. So I want to get a sense of the basic design of this ironwork, the circles and the swirls within it, but I'm not going to get bogged down trying to draw it in exact detail. That's just going to end up an inky mess. The other thing you might have noticed me doing was when I have anything symmetrical such as this, I bounce from side to side, side to side, just flipping my line work into the mirror of the other side. I find it's far easier to get something that at the end looks symmetrical and not wobbly and wonky, to go from one side to the other. So I'm thinking about where are the depths of plane, and then I'm thinking about my strategy of where do I start? Where is the best starting point for this for me? And then how will I progress it? From my starting point, do I go up or down or sideways? Do I start at ground level? Do I start in the center? Is there a reason to start somewhere else? Now, my general principle is there are lots of advantages in starting in the center, particularly given the way I draw, where I tend to establish parts, relatively small parts, and move outwards from there. And that's because I'm drawing directly in ink. There's no pencil, there's no erasing. And if you're wondering, as I often get asked, why am I not blocking out the rough shape? It's because every mark I make will be here on the paper as part of the drawing at the end of the drawing. And if I put marks in places where they're not really accurate and I need to refine, and the finished drawing doesn't cover those marks, well, I'm going to have a lot of excess marks that in my mind are going to end up being quite distracting. So I've tried to work out a way of drawing, a way of strategizing that lets me draw the way I want to draw, which is directly freehand in ink, but to have, the way I think of it, the maximum chance of getting my proportions correct. And in a scene such as this, as I talked about a lot in a video I posted yesterday, we're all the time jumping from seeing two-dimensional shapes and trying to draw those shapes where there is an actual shape, but always in the context of the three-dimensional form that that shape is a part of. And that means that edges may not be a straight, a sharp corner in life, and therefore a hard, sharp line may not capture the feel of what we're looking at well. So it's all of this stuff in our thinking as we look at what our subject is and we think, hey, how am I going to translate this photo into ink on the paper? And sometimes lines are helpful, sometimes dots are helpful, sometimes little dashes and curly things are helpful. Sometimes gaps we leave between the ink on the paper is the most helpful thing of all. So these are all the possibilities we swirl around. You know, what direction we do hatching, what direction we put lines. I talked about that just a few minutes ago, about how I think I probably would have had a more effective drawing if I'd done those close vertical hatching lines to create the dark value, if I'd done them the other way. So all of this is happening before I've picked up my pen. And by the time I've thought through all of these questions and tried to work out answers, I'm able now to start to visualize in my head how I think my finished drawing is going to look. I can actually start to picture the decisions I'm making about these things. And I think it's really important to realize that if we start to draw without having tried to think through these things before we're committed to the ink on the paper, and remember it's irrevocable, can't take it off once it's there. If I start to draw before I've worked this out, I'm just guessing. I'm just having a guess at what I hope's going to work, and I'm adding one guess onto another guess, onto another guess, onto another guess. And then I'm wondering why it hasn't all come together. Because it's my planning beforehand also, it's the thinking all these things through that help to create a coherence in my planning, and therefore in the issues I'm going to face, and therefore a coherency in the solutions I find in the ink on the paper, and that will bring things together and create visually a unified drawing rather than looking like different parts were done by different people on different days with different pens, which is what happens if we focus on one small part and then we focus on another small part and we just basically rotate around the drawing area in that way. We become disconnected with what we've done before, and we're not using the same sorts of approaches and techniques and marks then. So this planning, this continuity, so all of this has been happening in my head before I've picked up my pen. And then when I do pick up my pen, the first thing I do is not to start my drawing, but it's to experiment with some of the marks I'm thinking I'm going to use to create some of the effects that I have in the particular scene. So it might be one of the major things. It might be the trees in the background. It might be the wrought iron fence. I'm only going to spend in most drawings 2 to 5 minutes doing this. If it's a complex drawing and it's a larger drawing, look, I might spend 5 or 10 minutes doing it, but generally it's 3 to 5 minutes, and I'm just playing around with marks, seeing if what I'm thinking is going to produce the results I want before I commit to the drawing. Particularly if there's something that looks a bit tricky, a bit challenging, that's going to be in a very prominent place and it's going to be very key, and if I don't get it right, if I haven't worked out the best way to do it, it could have fairly big impact on how the drawing looks. So particularly if there's something like that, then I'm going to want to have thought about it beforehand. But I do my experimental marks and then I evaluate them. I look and thinking, okay, is this what I'm wanting? Is this the effect I'm wanting? And if I'm happy with it, then I can move on from that point. If I'm not, I can experiment with some different marks. And let me say, I have decided at times not to go ahead with the drawing that I was planning to do, planning to demo. I've got the camera all ready to go. I've got my reference photo ready. I've got all the pens and stuff, because I then haven't been able to find the marks to create the effect, the appearance that I want of different parts that I'm happy with. And I know that if I haven't worked them out, if I don't know them before I start to draw, there's no point starting to draw and just crossing my fingers and hoping for luck and just, as I said before, guessing. I'm better off leaving that subject and either doing perhaps a simpler type of that sort of thing, whatever it is, or just have more time practicing and experimenting when I don't feel the need to have a finished drawing quite so quickly. So that's what I need to do. When I start to draw though, when I actually now pick up my pen and start to draw, and look, depending on our level of experience, we may spend 30 to 60 minutes thinking and planning, depending on the size of the drawing and how we're hoping for it to look. But this is something we get faster at and doesn't take up nearly as much time, can really just be done in minutes once we become very comfortable with this process. But now I pick up my pen and I've done some experimenting of marks. And I've worked out exactly how I'm hoping my drawing's going to look. I've almost seen it in my head in a way that I now just get to copy what's in my head and the marks that I've used to create the effects that I've wanted. So now I get to, and I've experimented to confirm that. And the other thing is to choose the pens I'm going to use. And that's another good thing about experimenting with marks, is by choosing the pen I hope to use, or I think I'm going to use, and doing my experimentation marks the same size as that part's going to be in the drawing, I can see whether my pen width is too wide or not wide enough. Whether I can get the effect, or perhaps it would have been a good pen on the first day I bought it, but it's a bit run dry, and so it's not giving me what I want or what I'm thinking I need. And so this is all important too, because I don't want to be a quarter of the way through the drawing and thinking, oh, this pen is just too thick. I should have chosen a thinner one for the sorts of detail I'm trying to draw, the way I'm trying to draw it. So all of these things now happen before I start my drawing, but it does mean I can start my drawing nicely confident. And I've actually also, although it's not the intention, with the experimenting, I've warmed up my hand-eye coordination as well. So I just have a bit of confidence in my mark making, rather than being hesitant and trying to sort of find the tempo with the actual drawing. So that's great. When I start to draw, I also have to be very aware of not compromising my ability to create the effect I want later by things I do now. So particularly at the start, when I'm mapping out areas and places, and for instance, if I have something in the foreground that's in front of a part of the midground, which often has the main subject, I need to make sure that I leave blank the paper, the white, where that foreground object needs to be. So I need to always slow down. I need to, and this is again where, when we're looking at the picture before we start at the photo, we're thinking, okay, this garbage bin it might be, or this bus shelter, or this group, this family are in front of the building. That's the main thing. So when I get to this part, I need to stop the building and position where the family is. And for me, normally, I wouldn't actually draw the family then, but I would put a dot where I think the top of the family group will be and a dot where their feet will be. And now I leave that. And then I come back and I draw the figures after I've drawn the rest of the building behind with this generous allowance for where the group will be. And that way, I find that I'm far better at getting the scale correct, of having the people look like they're the right size for the size of the building behind them and the distance they are from the building. So these are all little process things I've worked out help me get the result I want. If I drew the people first, I've discovered a long time ago that often they're too large or too small when I draw the building behind. It's better to draw the building, which is larger, and then to work out where the figures go. But as I said, I don't start drawing the figures straight away. I put a dot where I think the top and the bottom of each figure will be, and I then imagine the figure there firstly in my mind, and I think, does that look right? Do they look like they could walk in the door and all the relative sizes, the overall scale of everything would be correct or not? The other thing I've learned is draw the head very small. Draw the head smaller than you think, because invariably, I found for me, that works better. If I try and draw the head the size I think it should be, my heads were always too large, and then you're tempted to leave the neck out to fit the figure in the rest, or you get down to the waist and there's not room to draw legs that look human. So these are all the ways if we're thoughtful in what we do, and if we analyze the results that we get, we can refine our process, we can refine our method. It's all to do with understanding what we're doing. And to understand what we're doing, we need to have a very clear picture of what we want to have at the end. Our drawing shouldn't be a lucky dip. It should be bringing into being the thing that we've planned in our mind to bring into being. It doesn't mean it has to be realistic. We don't have to draw with realism. We can draw with semi-abstraction if we want. We can have a pretty way out drawing style, but that's all part of what we're planning before we pick up the pen. But as I was mentioning before, it's important not to put marks on the paper that will stop us being able to draw things a bit later on the way we want to. So for instance, if I don't want a heavy line for an outline for something, I shouldn't do a heavy line for an outline at the start when I'm trying to block things in. I often, for the tops of trees, do a series of dots because they can be hidden in the final line work, the final marks. So things such as that. And when I've got a building such as this, when I'm trying to work at where, say, the other end of a wall is, I will put a dot first, just as I do for the top of the heads of the figures. And I'll then imagine the wall from the corner I've drawn to where that dot is. And in my mind, I'll put the wall there. And I think, does that look right? Does the proportion of from there to there work out with the proportions in the rest of the widths of the building? And so forth. So I find all of that really important. Can you see how if I was just to start to draw by, oh, this is an interesting gatehouse, I'm going to draw that, and within a minute, I've got the ink flowing on the paper. I've not had a chance to do any of this planning, because in the end, a successful drawing doesn't come from practicing drawing techniques. It doesn't come from practicing hatching, from drawing straight lines, from drawing circles freehand. It doesn't come from that. It comes from knowing how to use those things, and how I use those things depends on what I want to have at the end of the day. Those things are my tools. But it's the project I want to create that tells me which tools I need to use and how I need to use them and when I'll need to use them. And in drawing, that's my planning before. That's my picturing in my mind the finished drawing in as much detail as I can. And that's working out then where to start and how then to move around from that. Now in this drawing you might have noticed I started with that upper window, that bow window that's above the actual gate, partly because it's in the center, and if I worked hard at getting the proportions and the angles with that correct, then I could measure in each direction, left and right, and then down to the ground level. And so I did underneath that next, and that then gave me a foundation for moving left and right and working at keeping the angles as we see them in the reference. So you see me now doing the trees behind. trying to get a bit of a lighter feel, not over inking. And notice how I haven't drawn a heavy straight line around the edge of the top of the foliage, because in my mind that doesn't create the effect that we see in life. In the end, we get to choose how we put ink on the paper to create whatever we want to create. And we should always, at the end of a drawing, evaluate what we're doing. Work out, has it worked? As I did with the line work that I've used for the hatching for the brickwork. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, stop drawing the wrong way. Stop drawing in ways that don't produce the drawings that you want to have. Don't blame somehow your ability to put ink on the paper. It's almost certainly, at least partly or mostly, the process, the understanding of the drawing process and how you start and progress and finish. It's picking up the pen too quickly before planning what to do. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.